Thank you. Hello, everyone. Today I will talk about one of our projects, Microsoft Research Fetch Climate. We did this project with close collaboration with Computational Sciences Laboratory in Microsoft Research Cambridge. I will be making this talk together with my colleague Dmitry Grechko, PhD student in our department. And I should thank our colleagues from Microsoft Research Cambridge for this collaboration, especially Drew Purves and Vasily Lutserev. Without them, this project won't be possible, I should say. Okay, so the title of my talk is Cloud Technologies for Computational Sciences. What is computational scientist and what is his or her common task? Computational scientist has primary task. Primary task is to build models. If we are talking about computational ecologist, the primary task is to build computational models of ecosystem, biosystem, and, for example, species occurrence. A very simple model of the species occurrence is shown on the screen. So it defines probability of species occurrence with some region with temperature and precipitation, T and P, average temperature and average precipitation, as a combination of two Gaussian distribution. So scientists say, this is my model. This model has some unknown parameters, temperature optimal and precipitation optimal and probability maximum. And the next goal is to fit models with data, to get these unknown parameters from the observational data. Then scientists perform simulation with fitted models, validates and adjusts models, and after this loop is over, scientist wants to share his results as a scientific paper and to share this result in a reproducible manner. So anyone can repeat what he did and understand, is he right or is he wrong, or maybe to improve his result. This is the primary activities of computational scientists. But they are heavily depends on non-primary activities of background or system. Scientists need to find useful data, for example, average data on temperature and precipitation in different locations where he wants to model the ecosystem. Then probably scientists needs to choose data set among available. And if we are talking about climate data, there are a lot of climate database. Which database is the most appropriate for the task? And then scientists should prepare the data for usage. This is quite technical task involving some programming, data transformation. For example, different climate database has different formats. Some are just text files, like Berkeley Earth observational data. Some are binary net CDF files. They may use different geographic projections. So before computational ecologist get this temperature and precipitation, he need to find and transform a lot of data. And this is not the scientist's strong sides. That's why we created a project which is called Fetch Climate. It's a cloud service. Its primary purpose is to serve computational scientists with environmental data in a way they want this data, not in a way the data present in the system. So what Fetch Climate does? In fact, it evaluates fetch function. This function is quite simple. For example, this is air temperature in some spatial area omega, in some temporal region t, with timestamp tau, and the result of this function is three values. Actual value of average air temperature here, the uncertainty of the result, and the provenance, the data set which was used to get this data. So a few words about input parameters. Spatial area is generally a rectangular area over the surface of Earth from some latitude mean to latitude max and from longitude mean to longitude max. In simplest case, omega is just a single point, latitude, longitude. T, or temporal interval, may be more complex. For example, typical request is get me the average temperature for January for last 10 years. So this is not a continuous interval, but a union of several intervals. And to get this data, the system must fetch this 5, or in this picture 5, layers of data or hyperslabs, and to average the value. T is timestamp. When it is specified, it's typically a moment where a request was made. Why it is important? And why this function returns 3 values: value, uncertainty, and provenance. Because we are talking about defensible science, so if we have some model or even some decision made based on this model, we need to defend our point of view. And to defend our point of view, we have to be sure that results are absolutely correct. So uncertainty shows the interval of unknown. Uncertainty, sigma, typically reflects our incomplete knowledge of the quantity. If we say that average temperature in January in Moscow region is -10, we are 100% wrong. It's not -10. It's -10 dot and several numbers. But if we return some interval of uncertainty, then we are probably right. So the correct answer, a mean temperature in the Moscow region is -10 plus minus some value. The exact definition of uncertainty depends on the field of study. Some use standard deviation noise, some use confidence interval. In Berezin approach, it may be credible interval. We are working with statistical representation. It's standard deviation. So it's very important to return not only value, but also its uncertainty. Reproducibility. If we publish these results a year ago, and this result refer to our fetch climate system, the system is not static, and probably more climate data is uploaded, more information about measurement station are uploaded, and the result of the same fetch function may be slightly different. Not -10, but -10.5. And the result of entire paper, of entire study, may change. How to understand? Does anything change in the system, or does the result of scientific article is simply wrong? That's why we introduced this timestamp, and system respects this timestamp. So if we put the same value of tau to this fetch function, the result will always be the same, even after the invocation, some new data were uploaded to the system. Okay, and third value is provenance. It's very important because one major feature of fetch climate is not to average just a single source of climate data. As my colleague will tell a little bit later, there are a lot of climate database that provides value of temperature from different sources. And depending on the spatial and temporal region, different sources can be changed. If we choose point near the measurement station, the result is probably from this station. If we choose a large square somewhere in the ocean where no ships are passing, no meteor stations, then the result is probably will be taken from some computation model output. So the function of fetch climate is to unite, to make a fusion of multiple database, and the output value D, or data or provenance, is identifier of source data set that was used to produce the result. So scientists can understand exactly where this data come from. But this fetch function is rarely used as it is. Typically, the goal of scientists to extract entire data cube. So the Moscow region is split into several rectangular areas, n by m, and temporal axis can also be divided into some areas. And for example, if we request a grid of 5 by 5 cells for last 5 years. Then we receive 5 by 5 by 5 data cube, which is shown as a function here. And here is the first opportunity of parallelization, because each computation of fetch function can be done absolutely independent from others. So this is a demo of the fetch climate application. It is available in the web now. I will open it. And it provides data in 2 different ways. Okay. This one. No network. First, we have HTML5 interface for modern browsers. It works on iPad, Microsoft Surfaces, but not fully correct, works on some Android devices. And we have programmatic API, which is the most important way to use fetch climate. A computational model can get the data programmatically by invoking some API available from C#, C++, or JavaScript application. So this is fetch climate interface. We have a set of variables we can fetch, for example, air temperature. And each variable is served by several data sets: WorldClim, and SEP, CRUCL, and so on. You can learn about data sources here. Let it be air temperature. Then I select when. I select a single year for the start. Single year, average over entire year, average over entire day. Where? Well, let it be part of Moscow region. It is not okay. And we are extracting 40 by 40 grid. Then fetch data. I think this request should take several seconds, 5, 10, yeah. Okay, so this is the data, average temperature for year 1990. What is interesting? We can see uncertainty, and uncertainty is different here. And we can see the provenance. And provenance is even more interesting. We can see that we have composed this grid from 3 data sources. Some data sources are served by WorldClim data. It's mainly land. Some shore regions are served by CRUCL data source. And seas and oceans are served by NSEP and car reanalysis. This is because reanalysis is a result of computer model. And on the land, there are meteorological stations. On the ocean and on the seas, probably, there are mostly computational models show the results. So these are 3 values returned from fetch function: values, uncertainty, and provenance. And probably another example is programmatic fetch. I can show you JavaScript, simple JavaScript application. That resolution of the screen is not as big as I would like. Okay. Here is typical asynchronous invocation of the service. We create request for one scattered point in Moscow, specify temporal region, and get relative humidity. I can run. Click here. And after a few seconds, I will get relative humidity in Moscow with uncertainty. It's interesting to notice that uncertainty in summer months are higher than in winter and in autumn. How uncertain is compute? Dmitry will tell. So I think it's time pass microphone to Dmitry. He will tell about data sources and computational algorithms.
Yeah, thanks. So, where is he? Let me know. Yep. As Sergey said, we have a couple of data sets in the pitch climate now, and all of them have a different structure. We use a separate layer to access the data. This layer provides the data in a uniform view using a common data model. So this representation is developed by Unidata community and is widely used among some research groups, especially in climatology. Yeah. So what is common data model of CDM? So each data set is a set of constraint variables, and each variable is a notated multidimensional array. The layer provides us provides some guarantees for us that if we define different variables inside the data set on the same dimensions, the variable will always have the same length along the specified dimensions. So the data is always consistent. And more interesting part is that this representation is self-describing. So each variable has some metadata, so that's why the multidimensional arrays are annotated. And there are some conventions that can be found on the site of Unidata. And if we follow these conventions, we can figure out what units are used for the storing of the data, and what is some missing value and some other values. So we can fetch this semantics of the data using the metadata here. And as well, we can associate each element of the multidimensional array with some point in time and space. This is provided for us by the constraints of dimensions. Yeah, so here is one data variable, P rate, which is precipitation rate, and three other variables that are actually access. They are described where this describes the region where the data is defined. And we use Dmitriev package. This is .NET software, maybe a set of tools. And the API, it is developed here in University, Moscow State University, together with Microsoft Research Cambridge, and it provides this representation CDM to the variety of actual storage formats, starting from CSV files and ending into our technologies that we are using in Fetch Climate, the storage in Azure. Storage data in Azure. So what data set do we have? They can be divided into three broad types. So the first type is time series and scatter points. We have a set of static stations on the surface of Earth. They do not move. And for each station, we have a time series, so the values that are observed at these locations. As an example, here I put a global historical climatology network data set, so it's about 20,000 stations here, and corresponding time series. Yep. Another type of data sets are the long-term average grids. Actually, this is pre-processed time series. So different research groups use some interpolation techniques and produce high-resolution grids. As an example here, I put some subset of world climate data set. This is temperature in April near the Moscow. The unit is tenths of a degree. Yeah, and actually this work that the production of data sets like this is similar to the work that is done by Fetch Climate, but in Fetch Climate we try to make it automatic without any interactions with people, and in the data set like this, the research group they split the initial set of stations into some tiles, performed interpolation along tiles, then they merged tiles, so there was some interaction with the people, and we want to do something like this, but without any interaction. Here, with clean data set, you can see that it is the average values for the separate months. So it has only 12 time layers, and each layer is a 50 years average. Yeah, and as last broad group of data sets are the grid data sets, which have high resolution in time. Generally, they are global circulation models outputs. So here you can see the visualization of reanalysis 1 model output, and here is the precipitation rate near Earth's surface. These data sets are targeted for temporal variations in parameters, and here in this data set we have the values for each 6 hours, but the spatial resolution is rather poor here. So we have different broad classes of data sets and different classes used for different requests. And our task is to choose the appropriate, more accurate data set to generate the final surface that is requested by the user. What fetch function does? Fetch function, as Sergey described it. So that's pseudocode. What do we do? So first we extracting the available data sets for the timestamp, and then we try to evaluate the uncertainty of the result that can be generated using each of the data sets. So we enumerate all of our available data sets and evaluate the uncertainty of possible results. And this is the point of parallelization. In fact, it is done in parallel. Then we choose the value of uncertainty that is the lowest uncertainty, and then we produce the final value for the requested point using the data set that can produce the lowest uncertainty here. So, and this is performed for each point of the request. And as a result, the user gets the mean, the uncertainty of the value that is produced with that data source with the best yes index and the identifier of this data source. During the uncertainty estimation, we do the following. Actually, now, before publishing every data set to the to fetch climate, we perform some separate analysis. We try to find some other data set with reference values. We call reference values the values that are considered to be exact, maybe with the respect of some measurement and uncertainty, but we assume that they're exact. And then we just generate the values for the reference sites using our data set that is under the investigation, and generate the sample of pairs, so the reference value and the computed value using our data set. When we have this set of pairs, then we can just calculate the difference, and this difference is actually an error of the value produced by this data set. And then we perform an analysis and try to find any dependencies between this error and the location of the site. It can be latitude or altitude of the point and some other predictors. But this approach is it doesn't work very well, and for some data sets it is even impossible to find any reference values. So now we are actively working on another approach, which is uncertainty propagation, and this the core idea of it is just to apply the methods of data processing that consider uncertainty. So we pay more attention to the uncertainty, and I'll show you the set of methods on the next slide. Yeah. So how do we process the data? Now we have two groups of methods. First one is the fast methods that are usually they have linear complexity, and in most cases it is enough to use this method for the ecological tasks. So the performance is has more priority rather than accuracy. And the second group is the more accurate methods that produce more good surfaces that are more smooth and that provides more reliable uncertainty values. So when we process grids, we just use the linear interpolation if the grid represent some individual observations, but sometimes grids represent already averaged values like world CRIM data sets, and we don't know how climate variable the function and the nature of the climate variable inside the average period. So we just interpolate it with a constant, and we have a step interpolation inside the average period. And this behavior is enough for us because we have lots of data sets, and if we have to use this interpolation, it is very likely that that some other data source which do not require step interpolation will be chosen for producing the final result. And as for scatter points and time series, we have two phases of work. First, we transform the time series to the single average values. So again, we use linear interpolation, and we have some experimental work using more complex models like autoregressive moving average model that are more computational complex. And after getting the average values in at each of the stations, then we perform some interpolation of scatter points, and we use inverse distance weighting and thin place spline now, and we use a local version of thin place spline because of its complexity. But the administrator of the fetch climate instance can combine these methods as he wants. So when he tunes the fetch climate, he could choose what method to use, and because there is always a trade-off between performance and accuracy. What else? I think that's all that I wanted to tell.
Now it's my turn to describe how we implement all these computational algorithms to return results generally in a couple or 10 seconds. So scientists get satisfied, and I can also demo fetch climate without waiting 10 minutes for the results. So first is how to store source raw data set. As Dmitry says, all source climate data set are conformed to common data model format, so they are actually multidimensional arrays. How to store multidimensional arrays so they are available from the cloud? We use Microsoft Azure Cloud, and one of the good storage type are blobs, binary large objects, like files mostly. The naive way to store arrays is linear storage. So elements of array are written one after other, but we will have some problem with extending the array. So in this example, we have initially array 4 by 4, 2 by 2, 1, 3, 3, 7. If we want to add extra row for 3, shown by light green, we can add this easily just by appending the file. If we want to add extra column 4, 5, 2, we need to transform entire array by inserting 4, 5, and 2 into specific locations. And also, we'll have the problem if we want to read one column of the array. And as you may understand, the typical operation that fetch climate computational engine will apply to the raw data is hyperslabing, taking some slice by time, or taken by some time series, or taken by some column by getting time series. So the approach, which is widely used right now, it is used in HDF5 library, hierarchical data files, is chunking. The idea is quite simple. We divide index space, 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional or more, or with more dimensions, into smaller data cubes, which are called chunks. In this example, we divide 2-dimensional space into chunks 2 by 2. So simple array, our initial array 1, 3, 3, 7 will occupy one chunk, and chunk directory will contain one item. If we want to add extra row for 3, we simply add incomplete chunk for 3 and increase chunk directory to 2 elements. And if we want to add column, we leave our chunks intact and just add another 2 incomplete chunks, 5, 4, and 2. So increasing chunk array is quite easy. And what is even more important for us, if we want to read some column or row of the data, we don't have to read entire file or entire blob. We can read only the chunk that intersects this hyperslab. And this is widely used in HDF. And we have implemented storage in the cloud that use chunking approach. A few words about it a little bit later. But the main question with chunked arrays are what is the right chunk of what is the right size for the chunk so system is performant. There is no exact answer to this question. There are papers, workshops by HDF5 communities to find out the appropriate chunk size. And the answer is chunk size is appropriate to the specific task. So depending on the read pattern of the read geometry, different chunk size may be useful. Here are some of our measurements. On two axes there are chunk sizes as power of 2, so 10 is 1 kilobyte. And here's performance of the reading, so small vertical chunks are not very efficient. Narrow but long chunks become efficient, but chunks 1 kilobyte by 1 kilobyte is symmetrical, is quite efficient. But again, this depends on the task. That's why both HDF5 and our fetch climate leaves the selection of chunk size for the user. We doesn't make any recommendation. So how array storage for Azure works? We have, for example, two-dimensional arrays. Actually, mostly we work with 3 or 4-dimensional, but two-dimensional are good from example point of view. So we have function chunk2d, which translate indices in the array, I and j, and chunk size, chunk width, and chunk height, into name of chunk, which is actually name of blob in the Azure storage, and index of array element in the chunk. And then if someone wants to fetch an element or a set of elements from this chunked storage, it finds out sequence of chunks that contains necessary elements, indices of elements inside chunks, and puts this request into queue. Then multiple worker instances get this request from the queue, extracts blob, performs hyperslabbing of the blobs, and puts the result into response queue. And as load on our system increases, we can add multiple. We can increase number of worker roles to increase the bandwidth of array storage. And inside Windows Azure, the bandwidth of communicating with worker role and blob storage is quite high. So the narrow point of communicating with client is only here. So this is how our storage works, and we have utilities that allow us to uploading netcdf files and other CDM compatible models to the cloud. So the first way is to take this climate database and upload it to the cloud. And then we can efficiently parallel fetch data from it. So next is how fetch climate itself works. So each each extraction of data cube is a fetch climate request. What we can say about this request? They have very different processing time. From second, when I want just single point, get temperature, and this point, to probably hours, because we can request data all over Eurasia for 100 years and monthly average. We have a big amount of data to fetch, big amount of data to process, and they may take significant time. Another interesting feature of fetch climate is virtual variables. For example, computational ecologists all sometimes use evapotranspiration parameters, which is amount of water that goes out from the soil and from the plants to the atmosphere. And this evapotranspiration parameter is important for some ecological model, and it can be computed as a function of temperature, precipitation, air pressure, and a couple of other parameters. So we can define a function that defines a virtual climate parameter, and fetch climate can compute this parameter. So one of probable requests was build me evapotranspiration map for entire world with world clean resolution, 40,000 by 20,000. This may take several hours, and this is still legal request to the fetch climate system. So, based on these requirements, what we should have? We should have low latency request scheduler. So small requests will be processed quite fast. For large requests, we should have node restart protection, because in cloud system, each computation node can be restarted, or virtual machine running on this node can be transferred to another node or even another data center, and this is not a catastrophic event. This is supported by any cloud SDK, so this is the event we should be ready for. So long processes should be broken if node is restarted. Also, we need to split large request into smaller one and use some round-robin approaches, because if we have, let's say, 10 computational nodes and 10 very large requests came, then system is blocked until everything is computed. Until these large requests are done, no even small request, even for single point, can be made. So we need to split big request into smaller one and use some round-robin approach. And another potential property of fetch climate request is that they can be repeatable. We provide API for fetch climate to request data for some computational models. And if we run this program several times, it probably will issue the similar request. That's why server-side cache will be good. So data computed once will not be computed again if it is accessed within a days or within weeks. So all this request results in this fetch climate diagram. So a scientist, the only human in this picture, issues a request with HTML5 interface or runs a computational program that calls API. This request is handled by default Azure Load Balancer. Azure Load Balancer is a quite simple thing that will just distribute the request between multiple front-end roles using uniform distribution, roughly speaking. Front-end role performs two tasks. It puts this request into a small database which is called cache queue database, and front-end role also performs some transformation of binary data into JSON format if requests were made from JavaScript language. Cache queue is a simple database that both serves as a queue of pending request and cache of completed request. Its fields include a request hash. For each request, we compute a hash using SHA algorithm, which is almost unique for every request. We have status, submit time, and time the data was last accessed, and part count, total part field, which allows to split big request into number of smaller ones. So if we have a really big request, then we can split its spatial or temporal part into 10 or 100 smaller parts, and then we have 100 records, 1/100, 2/100, 99/100, 100/100. So it's number of part in the total part. And database contains status of the request, and request itself and its result data are stored again in the Azure blob as a single blob. So this is our cache queue of requests, and these requests are pulled by large numbers of worker roles. In our fetch climate deployment, we have 8 front-end roles and about 80 worker roles. Worker roles actually perform all this interesting stuff that Dmitry was talking about. They access raw data in chunked array storage and produce uncertainty and average values. But where are the algorithms for computing average values, for handling different geographic projections, for different uncertainty estimation? These algorithms are hidden inside data handler interface. And in fetch climate, there are actually two interesting parts. One is how these concepts are mapped to the Windows Azure environment. And second is how computational algorithms for uncertainty, for scattered point interpolation are implemented. And this iData handler interface is a point which divides Azure implementation from computational algorithms. So we can completely rewrite all of this stuff, leaving computational algorithm intact. Or we can plug in completely new computational algorithms for new types of climate data, new types of CDM, new schemas of CDM datasets. So what is data source handler? It is a very simple thing. It has only one method, process request async, which is a request to evaluate a fetch function for a specific data cube. A result is an array of average values. This was written in .NET framework in C# with async support, so here we use task classes. But Dmitry told about two-phase approach, when first uncertainty is evaluated for all data sources, and then only the data source that provides the least uncertainty, which is more confident in his result, is used to compute average value. This is hidden inside this method, getMaskAsync. So process request async first computes uncertainty and passes array of uncertainty to this method. And this method returns Boolean arrays of cells where we need to compute average value. Or if this data source is completely out of the process, it just returns nulls and process request async just stops. This saves a lot of work, so if some data source provides bad results for this request, it is no longer required to provide average values. Another interesting point is that data handler can invoke fetch climate system again. It can use fetch climate system data for his own purposes. And this is used in two scenarios. First, it uses digital elevation model, or just map of heights over the surface of the ocean, to correct some of the climate data. So some of the climate database, some of the climate data handlers ask fetch climate to get elevation model. And as we upload more precise elevation data, the results will be more precise. Another is implementation of virtual variables. I told about evapotranspiration parameter, and we have implementation of evapotranspiration that asks system for precipitation, temperature, pressure, and some other parameters using fetch data async, and then computes new value. So this is all that computational code should know about the architecture of the system. And this gives us quite a good extensibility and flexibility. So a few words about partitioning. Partitioning is splitting of one big request into smaller ones. It is required to take advantage of parallel processing. If system is in idle mode, we have 80 working roles waiting for something to do. And if you put some task, probably the spatial region will be divided into smaller parts and they will be processed in parallel, further decreasing the processing time. Another use of partitioning is to protect system from huge task. If we request system to provide 1 billion of elements in one data cube, it will keep worker role occupied for an hours, even not for a days. So the reason is to split this task into smaller one and use round robin to give other requests chance to be completed in observable time. One interesting point here is implementation of concurrent safe dataset. This is a CDM dataset, which is safe if we are writing to the different ranges of dimensions. And we just use the same data sets for multiple parts. And when all the tasks are complete, the data set contains the entire data. Another open question is, again, what is optimal part size? 100 items, 1 item, 1 million items. We analyze some of the logs of our system and choose some value that is currently about 3,000. This results in a good performance, but probably it can be better. So this was description how fetch climate was mapped, what fetch climate do, how it is mapped to the Azure, and I should say there is a lot of interesting things to do in extension of fetch climate project. One is improving uncertainty handling, and one is certainly automatic uncertainty generation. So if you upload your own data, the system will compute uncertainty automatically. One example is radioactivity at home project. Everyone could buy a simple Geiger counter device connected to USB and report the level of radiation at his location. It is a typical data set for fetch climate, but when we try to visualize this data, we get some yellow to red region near the Portugal. What happens? Is radioactivity in Portugal high? No. The answer is there is no points in the Portugal region, and approximation spline behaves badly. And if we have automatic uncertainty generation, and say, okay, the average level is expected to be high, but we are not so certain about this, so it plus minus a big value. Another interesting aspect of this is that many of the existing climate database were generated from point-based data sources. And they use also some uncertainty generation. If we'll be able to upload just point data to the fetch climate and get reasonable uncertainty in reasonable time, that will certainly increase the usefulness of the system. Another interesting area of research is about request scheduler. Different data sources have different computational complexity of estimated uncertainty. For grids, it's quite simple. For digital elevation model, it is even more simpler. There is a chart how error in measurement heights goes from north pole to the south pole. There is nothing to compute. But for point-based region, computation is quite high. It requires in some algorithm matrix inversion and so on. So how to organize the system so other data sources won't wait for slower one to compute the uncertainty. Another interesting question is how to predict processing time for the request. Users and scientists don't like to wait, but they can wait, and they can forgive you long processing time if you tell them from the beginning, okay, this request will be processing in 10 seconds. If it is processing in 15 seconds, it's okay. If you tell them this request is big, it will be processed in 10 minutes. Okay, they will wait for 10 minutes, they will have a cup of coffee or something like that. But if you put request to the system and there is no response for minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, probably you will have intention to turn this off and go and find data in some other place. So it's very interesting how to predict processing time based on request, based on available data sources, and based on system loading. And another interesting thing is how to average large regions. So what if we ask system to get average temperature for entire Earth using WorldClim dataset? The WorldClim dataset have 40 gigabytes of data. Do we need to upload all these 40 gigabytes into our worker role to perform averaging? Currently, yes. And this may request for large temporal and spatial region slow. But we can use some pre-processing, for example, building data pyramid. We have WorldClim data, which is 40,000 by 20,000. We can build smaller ones by averaging 20,000 by 10,000, then 10,000 by 5,000, and so on and so forth. Finally, ending with single value, which is average temperature for the entire Earth surface. And if we have this pyramid pre-compute, we can serve this request faster. And a lot of other things we can do with fetch client. So I think right now my talk is over. Here are the questions, and here I will put our emails so you can write us. Oh, sure, it's I need to remove hyperlink. Yeah. Okay. So again, it's all about artificial intelligence. Computers suggest what is better for humans. Sometimes humans doesn't agree. Okay, so I think we are almost get to the coffee break, but if you have some question, yeah. Yes, this is generally right. Average between, yeah, it's it is a good question, absolutely. And you can not only average between different data sets, you can probably increase or decrease uncertainty by combining data from different data sets. But this requires certain mathematical approaches which are not well developed yet or not yet known to us. And if we choose a single data source, let's say WorldClim or NCEP, we can better defend the results. This is interpolation of NCEP. Yeah, you can try it yourself, you will get the same data. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Any other questions? Okay, so thank you very much. Please feel free to write the questions if you have any. And thank you.